Hello, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Barsuk. I am the Robert Herstick Professor of Medicine and Medical Education at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. I currently serve as the Executive Medical Director of Northwestern Simulation. I would like to welcome you back to yet another podcast in our series on simulation and healthcare education. Today, I have the distinct honor of interviewing Dr. Suzan Kardong-Edgren. Suzan currently serves as an associate professor in the School of Healthcare Leadership in the Department of Health Professions Education at the MGH Institute of Health Professions in Boston and a senior fellow at the Center for Medical Simulation. She is also the recent past president of the International Nursing Association for Clinical Simulation in Nursing, otherwise known as INACSL, and a past editor of the Clinical Simulation and Nursing Journal. She is an internationally known speaker, consultant, and educational researcher with over 150 publications. It is a huge honor to be able to interview her for the podcast today. Susie, thank you so much for coming on my show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I usually always start my podcasts with a little bit of interesting background about yourself and how you got involved in simulation.
I love this question because it really was about in 2004, and I was at the University of Texas at Arlington. I don't know if Beth Mancini was my boss yet or not, but Beth knew about CPR and the American Heart Association work and things that they were doing. Our dean was very forward thinking, and those first Laerdal and CAE mannequins were really coming online into nursing education. Our graduate faculty got one of the $250,000 CAE mannequins. And you know how they used to arrive in a giant crate, bigger than coffin size, with a 3-inch ring binder that was just full of all the directions. They opened up the coffin, took out the book, looked at it, put it back in the coffin, closed the lid, and shoved it over in the corner. Mindy Anderson and I were together there, and she pulled that thing out of the box, read the manual, and we started using a $250,000 mannequin to teach skin, hair, nails, physical assessment, basically, in our assessment class. So we had to write our own scenarios back then. And this is back when you used, I forget the name of the clear stuff, and the internet was pretty new. We went out and were copying things like malignant melanoma and putting them onto these clear transparencies and then cutting them out carefully and sticking them on the mannequin in different places and things. So we were back in the early days doing these kinds of things, writing our own scenarios for basically physical assessment and talking with patients and such. And our dean came through, saw all of this, and knew immediately this is going to be huge. And of course, I was there with Beth Mancini. And so I was in one of those rare confluence places where all the leadership saw the value of simulation instantly. And the problem then was that the faculty are much more reluctant than usually people who are forward thinkers initially. And so we had some faculty who were willing to go along, and we had many who were not. But everybody got kicking and screaming, or dragged into using mannequins because we got so many of them so fast from big grants. We had 20 Laerdal mannequins stacked up like cordwood in the hallways and had converted a lot of our classrooms into simulation rooms. And then we had to justify the use over the course of a year if we were taking classrooms out of the inventory for the university. So we all started doing simulation early on and just kind of got sucked into it and absolutely loved it from the beginning. So that's how I got started.
Awesome story. There are some unique challenges in nursing simulation that are maybe a little different than what other health professions, education professionals face. And you've done some landmark work with the National Council of Nursing, National Simulation Study. Can you talk about your findings in that study and some of the unique challenges in nursing simulation?
That was a really unique study in that it had all the funding that was needed. And all we know is that it was the most expensive nursing education study ever done. That's all they admitted to. We heard figures bandied about over the years, and they're huge. But they wanted to do it right. And the reason that study came about was boards of nursing around the United States were being asked over and over again by different programs how much simulation they could use. And some people wanted to do 100% sim in different courses. Other people wanted to do 50% sim, and they were asking for guidance. So they decided there really is no evidence out there. And so they called Pam Jeffries, who was really the mother of simulation at that time. And I was sitting in my office as a little beginning assistant professor at Washington State University, minding my own business. I was the editor of the journal at that point. And my phone rang, and I picked it up, and they said, we're the National Council, and we want to know what your consulting fees are, because we're going to do a very large study on simulation, and we want you to be one of the consultants. And I said, how do you even know who I am? I was this little snot-nosed assistant professor, and I had to run down the hall to our dean for research and say, I'm being asked about this. I said, what do I say? What do I do? And he said, tell him this, and we'll go from there. So indeed, I was brought in, and I can remember sitting in the tower on Wacker Drive, looking out at the lake and looking around at this room and thinking, I can't believe this is happening. I'm sitting there with Pam Jeffries and our leader, Jennifer Hayden, who was a master's prepared nurse, who was the person in charge of this gigantic study. And she basically said, okay, this is what we think we want to do. And what do you think we should be doing here? And we started off with, I'm usually the one who goes whole hog. Pam, I'm sure, remembers this. She said, I think we should go with 70% sim and 50% sim. And I said, I don't think we should do that, because that's pushing the bridge too far. And so we settled on 50% simulation substitution for traditional clinical, 25%, and then used 10% as basically probably what everybody was doing at that point. And the reason that this made sense was you didn't want to end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater if it didn't work. We didn't want to push it too far, because this is at a time when simulation was highly suspect and not really well understood by most people. We didn't really have the beginnings of the NACCL standards, I think, were being published at that point. Yes, they were, as I think back. So we were using the best evidence from those standards at the time, plus having to assemble all the scenarios. And most community health and psych were not using simulation at all at that point. There were very few scenarios, certainly not made by commercial companies, and very little selected pockets around the United States were writing their own scenarios for those two parts of the 7 different kinds of clinical that we do in nursing. So we had to assemble all of that and find schools that were big enough, that had enough clinical mannequins available and the space to be able to run. If they had 2 clinical courses going at the same time, they had the space and the manpower to run 2 50% groups, 2 25% groups, 2 10% groups. Well, that took a lot of schools out of the running from the get-go. And then you wanted people who had a vague understanding of what simulation was and were willing to be retrained in the methodology that we were going to use. So, and we had to have schools that were not already on probation for having high failure rates or things like that. So it kept narrowing the pot. Jennifer had to go out and investigate all the schools and see, what are you saying you really have? And through all of that work, that took a year in and of itself. And so the planning for the study was 2 years. After the schools were selected, we then had to do the sell job for the schools, for the faculty, the students that were coming in, and for the faculty, the students, and the larger whole is that we said, okay, this is what we're doing, this is what we're planning, and we were presenting this all along the way to people as we were getting it ready to go. And we had to hold informational sessions for the families of the students that were coming into the programs. Interestingly enough, when we were getting started, we had families that were demanding that their kid be in the 50% group, and they were not going to take no for an answer. And we said, that's not randomization. The other thing that happened was if people said, we want our school to be in the 50% group. And we said, no. Everybody's in all three groups at each school. And so there was some of that had to be cleared up also. So there were so many moving parts, so many interesting things that happened along the way that it was just a wonderful memory now. It wasn't particularly wonderful when it was happening. It was just like, oh my gosh, we're riding this wild ride as we go. So we had the person who demands that their kid is in the 50% group no matter what. That kid was put in the 50% group. Yes, they participated, and all of their data was thrown out along the way. We couldn't use them. We had people, faculty at different schools that were ended up being embedded who were saying to students, I really feel badly for you for being in the 50% group. You're probably not going to do very well. And it's just like, these are faculty who know better. All kinds of interesting things happened along the way. We had a dean come down in the first semester of the students observing people in the 50% group, and they were doing so well. The dean looked at other people in the room and said, I've never seen students perform like this ever as they started. What are we going to do to keep them entertained throughout the rest of school if they're already doing this well? So we had little anecdotal pieces happening all along the way, which were things that we could send out in our missives to the 10 schools in the program to let them know, buck up, be of good cheer, things are going well, everything's great. We had basically a drug safety monitoring board that was observing all of our data as it came in too, in case things weren't going well, so that we could, if at any time we needed to, pull the plug on the whole study in case it wasn't working the way we thought it was going to work, and save everybody. Because the unspoken thing was, if people didn't do well, we were going to have to remediate everybody to get them up to where they would have been if they were in traditional clinical. So all of that was happening at the same time. And in the end, what we found there were statistically significant differences, though minor, in almost all of the major classes. Interestingly, not so in the foundations course, which is the only course that all 10 schools taught at the same time. So 10 schools went through the foundations, but they were also the shakedown course with the people that were freshly trained, getting their sea legs, trying scenarios that were pretty standard. They were the ones that were more tried and true than anything else we had. But there really was no difference between groups. After that, everybody went off on whatever they were doing in their programs. And the only two other courses, I think, that there really was no statistically significant difference were something like community health, which would not be surprising, and maybe mental health, which would also not be surprising. So here's a great example of, is it statistically significant or is it clinically significant? I don't think clinically there really was that much difference. But the people who were in simulation in the mental health group got to see things that you couldn't guarantee that anybody else saw. So I would say as a more robust experience overall, because of the high quality simulations they were using, they actually got a great experience. So as it turned out, we followed a subset of all the students in the study into the first 6 months of their clinical practice, and they were being scored by people in their clinical practice sites. In the first 2 or 3 months, there was a marked difference between the 50% group and everybody else. But that washed out pretty quickly after about 3 months, and everybody was pretty much on par at the 6-month point. So that was a quick down and dirty of the study and the findings without boring the daylights out of everybody, because I could talk about that the whole time.
I find it fascinating because it actually set the foundation for how nurses are trained in schools, and that now schools are allowed up to 50% of the clinical hours being replaced with simulation. So it was a hugely important study. And even more so in the realm of, and you know better than I do, but when we onboard nurses, we find that anecdotally, at least the ones that have simulation heavy schools tend to seem better and more prepared up front. And again, as you know, that when nurses do their clinicals, they're often not allowed to touch or do. And with a simulation, of course, you can touch and do because there's no harm in making errors like there is.
Right.
So I think it's amazing, and congratulations on that work, because it's just so important. Which kind of brings me to another question about the safety environment, because I have several friends that are nurses that went through nursing school and have horror stories about their assessments and their simulations. And I know that there was an article about nurses eating their young a while ago. Can you tell me how that is currently, and how we move the bar to make assessments safe and more part of educational interventions?
Actually, I'm so glad you asked that question. I think you saw the LinkedIn string. It's just horrifying. It breaks my heart. And I have seen students that have been abused that way. And that has really become my end of career project is I'm not letting this go, and that we can't just put our head in the sand. There are a lot of deans who've never made the walk down to the sim lab and observed a simulation. They still don't really know what's going on. There are lots of faculty who are still waiting for simulation to go away. They think it's another flash in the pan. I think it is malpractice to not understand simulation as a nurse educator. And I am shocked that we're 20 years into this and that most nursing education courses do not include simulation as a mandatory. It should be a whole course in and of itself, and it's not. And I don't understand it. If you consider yourself a professional, you would know the tools of the trade. And we're already moving from mannequin-based sim into the VR world. And so you need to understand all the things that go with mannequin-based simulation, the pre-briefing, the debriefing, and those kinds of things to be able to even do VR well. So I can't explain it, but now we're coming down to AACN is really adopting competency-based education and outcomes. And there's a great opportunity for damage and abuse there. I just came off of another meeting with a group that I work with AACN, talking about how are we going to mitigate this, because I made sure they saw that LinkedIn string too. And they said, oh, and I said, yes, we need to stop talking about simulation in these big workshops that we've been doing as like 1 hour out of an 8-hour day. We need to not do that, because we're talking to people that don't do sim and they're hearing simulation as the answer. Oh, I'm going to do sim. No, that's not how it works. And they've said yes, and we're moving on to another way of rolling this out and using simulation to really be the linchpin between evaluating in clinical practice, evaluating in the classroom, evaluating in various forms of simulation. So we're working on those workshops and those way of doing things right now. This rolls into my work as a senior fellow for the Center for Medical Simulation, in that I am their dash queen, so to speak. And we're working on a dash worldwide community of practice, and really looking at something that Jenny Rudolph has talked about for years, which is there a way to give people a designated certification or number or tap on the shoulder from CMS and their method of debriefing using the dash, which doesn't really fit or doesn't just necessarily purport to support their method of debriefing, but any kind of scenario. And have people go through their paces in various forms, and then say, you are designated as a competent debriefer. You are designated as a developing debriefer. You are not designated because you are, unsafe at this point in debriefing. And helping people develop their skills and give them some kind of designation that allows them then to maybe have videos come in of different students doing different things or different debriefers doing different things, because I see the two both working in the same way, to be scored by independent raters who do not know these people. Because what we know is if you're a two-person shop and you're trying to give each other feedback on your debriefing, some people are ready to hear feedback and some are not. And is there a way to have a third party come and get feedback on their debriefing skills and help them grow without destroying a relationship when I have to see you every single day? And when I was at Robert Morris University, we had a school down the way that had a two-person debriefing shop bring some of their debriefing videos to us, and we all sat and watched and scored them using the Dash tool within our own school. And we don't care who they are. We gave them great feedback on what they were doing, both good and developmentally, and they left intact, whole, with good practices that they wanted to work on as they went forward in their work. So we did that on a tiny scale there. Is there a way to take that out and roll it out into a bigger whole? And we did one demo like that for our Dash community of practice this past year. What we found was physicians and nurses work in the world in two different ways. You basically have to charge by the minute because of your expertise and the work that you're expected to do. Nurses, we don't punch a time clock, but we are salaried and we can work, 50 hours a week. They're very happy if we're willing to do that, but we still get paid the same amount. For a Dash community of practice to be able to score a video that has come in, we realized if you do a whole pre-briefing and then a whole debriefing, especially with a student scenario that ends up being about 40 minutes of pre-briefing and debriefing together, that is too much for a physician to have to score, to sit there and watch all the things that we do. Is there a better way to have somebody select snippets of things that they want or things that they think they did really well that they want feedback on? And maybe especially for physicians who are, if they're going to be scoring this, because their time is paid by the minute. It's too expensive. So you need to get value for money. If it's nurses who are doing it and we want to get better, or other members of the healthcare team that are not paid the way physicians do at that high end of the scale, we might have time to be able to review the whole thing, but we're still figuring that out. And that is part of my job at the Dash community of practice.
Will it move the bar in the nursing schools so that the inertia goes away with the people that still believe that this is the way I was taught, so I'm going to teach this way? And, because Dr. Bill McGahey always says educational inertia is very powerful, and that people really feel that I had it hard, so you're going to have it hard too.
We can be the proselytizers, but there are some people that are not going to change. Having said that, I bet as I know, there are some people who really should not be debriefers. And when I was at RMU, again, I was the head of our simulation center, and I didn't normally debrief. That wasn't my job. But I said, you know what, if I want to move this way, I have to model the behavior. So I did debriefing for a while with people, and I picked out one of my pretty standard debriefings, and I put it up in front of my faculty, my staff, because we were staff that worked in the sim center, and debrief myself using the Dash, watching my video and saying, I noticed this, I did this. God, I wish I hadn't done that. That was actually pretty good. And then they gave me feedback. And the unintended consequence of that is that people said, you know what? I never would have thought of that phrase. And people were madly writing things down. I always stand up. And gosh, we're thinking, we always told you to sit down. Why did you stand up? But I always stood up. I look, and I'm and I should sit down because that looks much more relaxed. And I should sit in the middle of the room or in the middle of the table like you did, not at the head. And people started getting better really fast. And the students noticed it. So it became a normative thing that we could each choose a video that we either wanted help with, where something really went off the rails and we wanted to show it to each other and say, what could I have done better? What would you have done? or that we wanted to show something that we thought we were pretty ace of the base and am I as good as I think I am? And people could show that, and we would give them feedback on that.
Do you see any other challenges in nursing that simulation might have a resolution for?
The biggest issue we have right now, and again, in this meeting I just was in, we talked about this, is that simulation is practicing giving feedback. This is what we do. But the people who teach clinical, mostly in nursing at this point in time, are adjuncts. They may never darken the door of the nursing program. They're out in the clinical area, and they're going to teach as they were taught. And we talk about, we survived clinical. We had hours in clinical. We observed a lot in clinical. We may not have been able to allow to do much in clinical, as you alluded to earlier. But when they do get to do something, what do we typically say? Oh, you did that well. And then we walk away. That was good. And we go on and do something else. But they don't know what they did well. Trying to talk about the behaviors, noticing what did you do well? What could you improve upon, and how would you do that? We don't have the language for that. And we're working on that now. Again, all of this fits together for me. I'm so lucky. In my DASH community of practice, you did this well, and this is what I like about what you did. I noticed this behavior. I noticed this other behavior. And you did this in a manner that looked pleasing. You had a nice smile on your face. You asked permission before you did this. So you're trying to give people the understanding of what good is and what it looks like. You don't stumble into it by happenstance. And so we've all got this communication gap that we're trying to work on now. And I think simulationists, just by the very nature of what we do, are the most logical and first people to figure some of this out. And so I think that those skills transfer across everything we do. And so I think simulationists need to not just stay in the simulation wing, but come out and start proselytizing this communication skill set to everybody.
I absolutely agree. I've always said that when we do interdisciplinary training as well, and we practice our communication skills together, and then we properly debrief after events, simulation events, it improves the safety environment and the culture in general, because it's all about effective communication with each other in the end, right?
Oh, so let me throw this in. Very, very important. I've been in a lot of classes where we're trying to teach nursing students and nurses to speak up. So the thing that I have learned, and I bet you know too, is that when we're training all together in interprofessional education, we're going to get better outcomes if we train the people who are in the head of the room, that are in charge, to say, if you see me screwing up, you need to speak up. Because people are reluctant to speak up.
Yeah, I mean, speaking up is one of the most important things. We do train on that when I run some interdisciplinary in situ cardiac arrests in the hospital. And, we teach our resident code leaders to ask the room and to invite commentary. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Create an environment where people do speak up. And we expect that. I was talking to Michelle Abersold recently about this as well. Some of her PhD work was on failure to rescue, which is a term she doesn't like, but she found that the nurses that were best at identifying sick patients that needed to escalate were the ones that were more willing to take the risk and to speak up. And, I don't even know if that's the right term to say risk, because what is the risk? The risk is personal. It's maybe that the reaction of the clinician that's responding to you is going to be negative towards you. But in the end, if you look at it that, I am thinking about patient safety here, then maybe there's less risk. But exactly that is the essence of a safety culture, is one in which everyone feels that their voice can be heard and they can speak up. And SIM does that. Absolutely. And again, the DASH is awesome because making the SIM environment safe creates a safer environment, and teaching people how to be safe in an environment.
Absolutely.
Well, that's great stuff. Let's talk a little bit about your role now, your current role. You're at the MGH Institute of Health Professions within the Health Professions Education Program. What are you doing there now?
Well, I teach, I'm in charge of a lot of the courses in our master's program. We have several tracks, but I'm in charge of the sim track and teach the courses in that area. The assumption in those courses is that you've come with some kind of sim training. We have a very basic course, but because we're scattered all over the world and we're online only, we don't have mannequins for you to play with. We don't have those kinds of things. We can practice debriefing using videos and things like that. We do those in asynchronous, a couple synchronous sessions in one of the courses. But my main role is to mentor doctoral students. And I have 15 that I advise right now. Because Janice Palaganis and I are there, we have more nurses in the program than we've ever had before. It used to be very physician heavy. And it's lovely having them. And I have actually lived to learn or experience interprofessional education. We talked about it the bulk of my nursing career, and it was always pie in the sky. It wasn't happening, but I am living it now, and it is the coolest thing ever. My first PhD students, one of them was a physician, Jabeen Fayez, and my other one was a nurse, Nikki Fogg. And it's so wonderful that we had classes together and they worked on wonderful things and that they're educated together. None of us use our titles and we all go by first names, so that nobody really knows what anybody is until it comes up in happenstance within our program. So it's just great. I lived to see this wonderful thing happen. So we have a unique part of our situation too, is that I really realized, and in the SimGhost capability framework, they're basically, how do you develop as a simulation operations person, talks about getting a master's if you want to be in charge of a big sim center, which makes perfect sense. And so somebody needed to fill that space of how do you prepare simulation operations people who tend to be introverted, tend to be like working with equipment. They don't necessarily like to be out there in front of people, but there are those few people who really do want to be in charge of simulation centers and do that. We have classes for them too, where they learn to speak the language and work with and for each other in that simulation space. So I ended up at a really good spot, focusing on education and a simulation track within that, and I'm just having a great time.
Let's talk about your prior role as the editor-in-chief of Clinical Simulation and Nursing. Can you talk about your experiences when you were with the journal?
Absolutely. When I started with the Anaxel organization, the first editor of the journal was down the hall from me at UTA. And I forget why she had to give up the role. And she came down the hall to me. She said, I would like for you to take on this role. And I said, okay, well, what is it? And what are you doing? And she said, well, we've got this journal. We publish it in-house. And I said, well, let me read it. And so I read the articles in it. And I said, these are the best articles I've read on simulation at this time. I don't know why you're not with a publisher. And they said, we tried to sell the journal to a publisher and they said, you're not ready yet. And of course, typical Susie, I said, oh, I think you're very ready. I don't know what I'm talking about, but I thought it looks great to me because I knew what was out there. And I said, we need to try to sell to a journal. And so we put together what's called an RFP. And the place where you would go to do this is at a conference called the INANE Conference, which stands for something like the International Nursing Editors Association of Nursing Editors. And all the publishers of nursing journals and all the editors go to this meeting once a year. And so we were like little supplicants moving from publisher to publisher with our little RFP. And at that time, we were asking to be published online only. No other journal was doing that at that time. But we knew that our people were all pretty much techies and that we would feel very comfortable with that and that we wanted it that way only. The only publisher willing to take it on in that manner was Elsevier at that point because they could afford to take a risk because they're huge. And so we plighted our troth with them. And we were wildly successful almost immediately. We started off with, we'll have 6 articles every 2 months. And I quickly had 2 years backlog of things. And I went to them and said, this makes no sense to me. The point of publishing online is that stuff gets out quickly. And I've now got a 2-year backlog. This makes no sense. Why are we doing this? You need to be publishing every month. We need to be moving along here. And they finally realized, wait a minute, all our costs are already covered, because when they went ahead and did pagination and all this kind of stuff and set it up, their work was done. They just were waiting to publish it each month. And they said, why don't we go to what's called article-based publishing? And we will take things in as they come in and we'll start doing this. So that is what we did. And we were successful very quickly. We started publishing every month. We always had plenty of stuff to publish. It was great. What I learned being in charge and seeing everything that comes across the desk at that time, I read every article as it came in and sent it out. And I read every article and proofread it before it came out in the journal, is that publisher has control over the thoughts of a discipline. And that is very, very, very powerful. I decided what was going to get published and what was not, if it was fresh or if it wasn't, if it had been overdone or if it was still new. And that's unbelievably important. And I think you want somebody who's pretty open-minded. You want somebody who knows what's being published and what's going on. And I will say that today there are enough journals out there that I don't know if any one person really can know everything that's being published today. There was a time I was like a walking encyclopedia, is that I could actually quote the authors and what they were saying because I really had a good grasp of it. But there are too many things to know now. The thought of the big publishers is that if you're publishing or you're editor of one of their journals, 10 years is about the shelf life of an editor, because you probably know pretty good at what you're doing. You came in with an agenda of some sort, and it's probably time for fresh thoughts and fresh ideas. When I heard this from doing some of the editor training that they do for Elsevier, I thought, you know what, that is true. And I was coming up on 10 years at that point. And I thought, you know what, I could step down because I loved it. It's probably, again, the most fun job, the most important job I've ever had. But I thought, I love it so much. I don't ever want to love this so much that I couldn't walk away from it and let it go and let somebody else do it. And so I said, 10 years, I'm done. And rolled over into my associate editor, who's now about that time for her, and she's done, and they're picking a new editor now. And I think that's really a pretty good idea. There are people who've been editors of journals for years and years. And when I used to go to an age, there were people that had been there for 20 years in a journal, 30 years in a journal. And I can remember thinking, this is such a plum job. I know there's somebody waiting in the wings for you to die or retire and go away. And I don't want to be one of those people that people are going, oh my God, why doesn't she die, retire, or go away? So that I can have that job and that we can share that wealth. So I will say that I know how important that role is and how people should really want that role. If they think they have something to offer, that they should really go after those editorship roles.
Well, Susie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I learned a ton today, and I appreciate you sharing some of the history of your work. There's a lot more you've done that we didn't even scrape on, but an amazing career, and I look forward to what you're going to be doing in the future as well. So thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, and thanks for asking me, Jeff.
So to our listeners, thank you for listening today. In future podcasts, we will continue to discuss key aspects of simulation healthcare education with experts in the field. Bye for now.